And he said, Luis, you said I may see you like this. And you also told me that your goal was base camp to summit and back down to base camp. It wasn't base camp, summit, and then halfway back down again. You're not finished yet. Get on your feet and keep moving. The only thing I could think about in my sleep-deprived state was that damn mule on Aconcagua. Because there was Pete providing that kick that I needed when I needed it most. Over 62 hours later, we finally walked into base camp. And from that point forward, whenever I think about that stretch assignment, the thing that I always try to remind myself is that we are all capable of more than we could ever think possible. Now, the next lesson I got from Mount McKinley is one about failure. Now, this one's kind of fun. A little bit of a precursor. The guy in the red coat with the guitar, he can't play the guitar. And he also can't sing. This is Daryl. Daryl's a park ranger on Mount McKinley. Now, Mount McKinley isn't a national park, and so when groups come off the summit and they get back down to the halfway camp before they continue down to base camp and fly back to town, they have to check in with the rangers. They just want to know, anybody have frostbite, how many people summited, how many people didn't, et cetera, et cetera. So Daryl, being an Alaskan and responsible for this job, would stand outside of the ranger hut as groups passed. He's a gruff Alaskan from Talkeetna, and he'd say, you guys summit? Yep, congratulations, keep going. Did you guys summit? Yep, good job. Did you guys summit? No, come with me. He'd call the groups that didn't summit into the ranger hut, pick up his guitar, and he'd start playing this song called Gnawing the Burnt Crust of Failure. I'm not kidding. It sounded like a cat being thrown against a chalkboard. I'm not going to sing it, but the lyrics kind of go something like this. You've spent 3 weeks of your life on a hunk of rock and ice. A lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of effort. You didn't make it. Boo-hoo, boo-hoo, your life sucks. Boo-hoo, boo-hoo. The first time I heard this, I was actually with a group that summited and was sitting outside, and I kind of heard some of the lyrics, and I thought, they're going to drag him out of that tent and beat him to death with that guitar. They're literally going to kill him. I didn't think much of it because I had to work on my team and I was responsible for my clients, and I continued on down the mountain. Now, the next year I was on Mount McKinley with a very special group. It was a group of wounded warriors. And this group of wounded warriors was actually even more special because all of these guys were actually ex-special forces, Delta Rangers, Navy SEALs, and we sat in a snow cave for 6 days at 17,000 feet and actually didn't make the summit. Here were people that were more than willing to gut it out for as long as it took, and I was the one that had to make the call and say, we're running out of food, we're running out of fuel, it's time to go home. So as we walked back down the mountain and into 14,000 foot camp, I was actually kind of excited. I knew that Daryl was on the mountain, and I knew if there was ever a group on the planet that would actually kill Daryl, it was going to be these guys. So as we walked into 14 camp, I looked down the trail and I could see Daryl in his red ranger jacket standing outside the hut. And I started waving my hand like, hey buddy, hey Daryl, we didn't make it. I was so excited to hear this song finally, and I wanted to see how these guys reacted. So we all piled into the hut, and Daryl started in with his shtick, and then an interesting thing happened. That song was so bad, and it was so awful, that everybody in that hut started laughing. And I started laughing so hard, I actually fell off my stool and rolled around in the snow for a little while. So Daryl stopped his song, and then he looked around the circle, and he said something I'll never forget. He said, okay, now you guys above all others know what it means to serve. And you know what it means to lean in and do the hard work required and asked of you. But tell me if you haven't learned something a little bit more about yourself in the last 3 weeks. And this group of hardened veterans, warriors, looked at each other and said, you know, if you wouldn't have carried that block of cheese yesterday, I never would have made it. If you wouldn't have set up my tent for me, I was really cold. That was really a thoughtful gesture. So as these stories started coming out that I had no idea that they were thinking, Daryl looked around the circle and asked a very simple question. What's more important, the journey or the destination? Now here were guys whose journey had taken them all over the world, seeing some of the hardest things a human being can see. And still, for them to realize that journey was ongoing was a pivotal moment in their growth. I'll never forget that experience, and Daryl's still a ranger on Mount McKinley to this day, so whenever I'm walking up the trail and groups are coming down and they're humming that god-awful song, I know two things. A, Daryl's on the hill, and B, these guys didn't summit. But the interesting thing is, usually not one of them has a frown on their face. Now, at this point in my career, things actually started to pick up. The 7 summits, like I said, the highest mountain on each of the 7 continents, the one I got sent to next had very little to do with technical mountaineering. One of the 7 summits is actually on the border of Russia and Georgia. Mount Elbrus, a little over 18,000 feet, one of the most fantastic ski mountaineering trips on the planet. You climb to the summit of this thing, a little over 18,000 feet, you put your skis on, and you ski down to about 5,000 feet. Your quads will never feel the same again. And as I was doing these trips, which were pretty casual from a technical perspective, I was thinking, wow, my career's reached this easy street place where I'm getting sent to the cushy, cultural, faraway trips, and it's fun. I'm actually having fun doing what I'm doing. So the Caucasus are on the land bridge between the Black and the Caspian Sea where Mount Elbrus is. And because it's not cost effective to send guides over just to work in Russia and then bring them back home, the next place I would get sent to is Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa. So most guides would go over and live on that part of the world and bounce back and forth between Africa and Russia to do those 2 of the 7 summits. Technically the easiest, culturally the most rich, and definitely for me thinking, wow, my career has hit this place where everything's gravy, everything's good, why push it, why stretch it, I'm happy, I'm safe, this is exactly where I want to be. And as the years went on, sometimes we would summit, sometimes we wouldn't, but I finally got to this place where it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough. I still hadn't made it to the Himalayas. I was wondering if I would ever get the chance, and finally I went in to have a conversation with the boss. Maybe some of you have had this conversation with yourselves or your partners or with anybody in your sphere that goes a little something like, listen, I'm not pushing it hard enough. We're not pushing it hard enough. You know and I know that I'm capable of the next step. I want to get sent to the coldest, highest, hardest, most remote place we go. You know I'm capable. I know I'm capable. Put me in the game, coach. That kind of a conversation. My boss looked me square in the eye and said, you know, Luis, you're right. I think you are ready. Here I'm thinking I'm going to get to go to the Himalayas. Instead, I got on a plane that looks like this. I got off the plane in a place that looks like that. That's Mount Vincent, the highest mountain in Antarctica. A little over 16,000 feet on the Ross Ice Shelf. You fly a Russian jet called an Aleutian from South America to a blue ice runway in the middle of nowhere, where the back end of the plane opens up, you unload all of your stuff, you get in a smaller plane to fly to Mount Vincent Base Camp, you set up all your stuff, and then you literally, with your group, start walking into the middle of nowhere. Now, some seasons, there are multiple teams on the mountain, so you have buddies around, you know there's other people out there in support. But this year, my first trip on Mount Vincent, we were the first group on the mountain for the season. This picture, we were the only human beings within 400 nautical miles. Now, as we left base camp and I heard the plane flittering off into the distance and we were walking up the trail towards the first camp, a thought occurred to me. If we got into trouble, I could pick up the satellite phone and say, help, help, come get us. And chances are people would say, well, we'll come find you next spring. You're on your own. So this concept of burning the bridge behind you was very evident for me in Antarctica. Being able to rely on the strength of the person to your left and the person to your right, and you're only as strong as the people that you're with, and it's my job to make sure that they're strong, it was a sobering moment for me, where I worried about every hangnail, every sore tooth, any blister, everything that was going on. You're hyper aware of success and what it takes to get there. It was an incredibly powerful lesson to work in Antarctica, a very beautiful and very, very remote place. Now at this point in my career, things were humming, things were going the way I thought they were going to go. One would be excited, right? But instead for me, it was more like this. I'll never forgive the person that took this picture, actually. Anybody here have that thing called professional fatigue? Where you're in the game for so long, you're pushing so hard for what you want, and you're trying to get after it, that you just reach this point where you just don't know if that next thing's actually possible, if it's actually going to happen. And for me, it was no different. And the dream shot, the next tipping point, came in the form of an invite to lunch. I was back in Denver having lunch with a friend, and he said, you know, I invited this other guy to lunch. He's got this idea for a project in the Himalayas. I don't know if you'd be interested in hearing about it, but he wants to talk to you. And all I heard was Himalayas, and I thought, all right, I'm willing to sit here for a free lunch and see what he has to say. The person that my friend wanted me to meet was this guy. Don't let the monk hat fool you. He's not a monk, but he is a very, very snappy dresser. This is Eric Weinmeier, the only blind person to ever climb Mount Everest. Now at the time, Eric was an English teacher at a prep school in Denver. He had climbed Kilimanjaro and been halfway up Aconcagua. And as I sat down to lunch, never having worked with somebody that couldn't see, I reached my hand out across the table, finally met his and shook his hand and asked him what his idea was. He said, Luis, I'm sick and tired of blind people being told what they can and can't do. I want to be the first blind person to climb Mount Everest. We're going to do a small warm-up mountain next year after we build the team to see how it goes, and if that works well and funding comes through, the following year we're going to go try Mount Everest. Are you interested? Now, I'm sure we've all had that scary conversation where, hey, I've got a great idea. It's bold, it's innovative. Do you want in? Now, for some reason, there was no part of me that was based in fear. Of course, when somebody hands you that dream shot, for me, it was nothing but yes, 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 of course, absolutely. What a great idea. I'm so excited. I was driving home from that lunch, and I had a couple of really distinct thoughts. A, I had just agreed to climb Everest with the blind guy. B, that had never been done before. And C, was it a really good idea to even try? So after that, when we finally got the funding and flew in to do our little warm-up mountain, never having worked with somebody that was blind before, it was as much about raising awareness and as much about really helping people understand what's possible for people with disabilities as it was the expedition itself. And as we flew into this tiny airstrip to start our walk towards our warm-up mountain that was a little bit down valley from Mount Everest, this picture is kind of what it looks like. There's a cliff in the beginning and there's a cliff at the end of the runway. It's banked at 20 degrees. This tiny little plane with no door on the cockpit has to bank down at like 40 degrees to get enough lift to land. Everybody's screaming like they're on a roller coaster ride, and Eric's sitting next to me with his mouth in my ear saying, well, what does it look like? What does it look like? And we're screaming, shut up, we'll tell you when we land. So there were 8 of us working with Eric on this project, 8 mountain guides. We called ourselves Eric's Secret Service. There was always 2 on, 1 person in front, 1 person behind, and 4 people hovering, waiting for their turn for their role, working with him. And as we started walking up valley, this was one of the first years that we could do live satellite phone blogging. We were posting pictures and sending an article every single day, trying to rally the world around our cause and around our idea. And here we were thinking that everybody's going to get behind this. Everybody's going to get bought into what this is. And thinking that we're going to get all these inspirational emails in our inbox, and every day when we turn on the satellite phone, it's going to be nothing but keep going, good job, you guys can do it. The reality is the first emails we got went a little something like this. You're going to kill him. And not only are you going to kill him, but as the mountain guide who intentionally took a blind person to climb in the Himalayas, when you kill him, you're also going to destroy your career, because who's ever going to want to go climbing with the guide that intentionally killed the blind guy? So you're going to kill him, and you're going to destroy your career. Don't do it. We were dumbfounded. We continued up valley thinking, how can nobody believe what we believe? How can nobody see what we see? We know what we're doing. We have a good plan. When we're sincere in our communication, let's just keep going to our little warm-up mountain, and we'll see how it goes. And then we came around the corner in the valley and saw our little warm-up peak. Stopped dead cold, to the point where Eric ran into the back and was like, well, what does it look like? We're like, let's just get a little bit closer. I'm sure it'll look better once we get a little bit closer. Kept going up valley. He's like, well, what does it look like now? Like, well, you know, maybe we should just start climbing and it might get better as we just start progressing. It looks a little weird, not like the pictures that we've been studying. Let's just keep going. And as we started climbing on the mountain, this mountain is called Ama de Blam, which is just a little bit down valley from Everest, we realized it was one of the lowest snow years on record in the Himalaya. So what was supposed to be a very straightforward snow and ice walk was now this jumbled mass of loose rock patched together with snow that was incredibly difficult for Eric to walk, where every left foot and every right foot needed to be explained in great detail. Now these mountains are incredibly technical and incredibly steep, and also incredibly high, but you find a process, you find a path and a plan to actually make it work. Now, To give you an idea of how technical and steep these mountains are and how the altitude plays a part, if I plucked you out of this room and I dumped you on the summit of Mount Everest, you'd be unconscious in about 5 minutes and dead in about 10. That's what the altitude differentiator can do to you. So we break up Himalayan mountains into camps. Every couple thousand feet, there's a camp. Camp 1, Camp 2, Camp 3, and for any mountain over 26,000 feet, like Everest, there's a Camp 4. So Amada Blam actually has 3 camps. And this camp, Camp 2, is called the Bird's Nest. Now the reason why this is called the Bird's Nest is because in this picture, there's about 4,000 feet of air to the left of the tents and about 2,800 feet of air to the right of the tents, and this is the technical ridge that we were climbing. Now I know what you guys are thinking. Usually most people, when I give a talk, have the same thought at this point. How do you go to the bathroom up there? That's how you do it. This is Eric with his hiney over 2,800 feet of air, going to the bathroom. Of course, asking us, hey, am I that far off the ground, you guys? Like, no, you're fine. You're a couple feet off the ground. No big deal. He's actually tied in, but it gives you a sense of how technical and how dangerous every move you make can be. Now, to make matters more challenging on this expedition, about 3 days after this picture was taken, we had a storm. Now, I know we're in California, but if any of you have ever walked around on a sidewalk filled with just a little bit of snow and a little bit of ice, you know how slippery things can get. And this storm generated just enough snow to make what was already very technical and dangerous even more technical and dangerous. From that storm, one of our team members fell 150 feet and broke his leg. The shock of that fall actually started this process called pulmonary edema, which is an altitude sickness where your lungs literally begin to fill with fluid. So basically he was drowning in his own fluid and the clock was ticking, and we had to work with Eric to also keep him safe. So I don't know if anybody of you have ever given anybody a piggyback ride up and down stairs before, but try to magnify that with covering the stairs with snow and ice and also bringing those stairs to about 20,000 feet. To lower, drag, and roll our friend back down to base camp to get him on a helicopter was this massive 48-hour push where everybody was involved, including Eric. And as we finally rolled into base camp and got our friend on the helicopter, I realized that this was it for us. We were done. I sat down to have a very frank conversation with Eric at this point, and I said, listen, we've done as much as we can do. It's time to wrap up shop, call it good, go home. He looked me square in the face and he said, you know, Luis, we're already set up at Camp 3. You guys have to go up and get our stuff anyway. If you're close, just go for it. Go for the summit if you feel like it's okay. And I was literally backing away from his tent saying, are you sure? Because we can shut it all down right now and go home. He said, no, for the good of the team, if you guys are close, go ahead and go. I went over to tell the rest of the folks on our team, and then we took off like a rocket the next morning. We climbed in silence just for this sheer joy of not having to explain where the left foot went and where the right foot went to Eric every single step of the way. We were all excited because for the first time, we were all that close to summiting our first major Himalayan peak together. When we got to Camp 3 in the afternoon above the clouds, I was first in line with a couple of Sherpas we were working with on this expedition. And I got on the radio to my teammates and I said, I'm not waiting till tomorrow morning to go to the summit. I'm too close, a storm can move in, I'm not taking the risk, I want this so bad, I'm going to go with the Sherpas and I'm going to summit tonight, I'll see you guys back down here for dinner. Everybody got on the radio, wished good luck, and off I went. Now summits, if you've ever been to the top of any mountain, you know that they're very, very busy places. People are taking pictures, putting on layers, having snacks, having water, and for me, the summit of Amada Blam was no different. It was my first major Himalayan peak. I was really excited. I got on the radio to talk to everybody, and Eric finally quietly came on the radio at base camp and said congratulations. And the minute I heard his voice, I knew I had just made the biggest mistake in my professional career. I had blown it. The guy that brought me there, the reason that I was in the Himalayas, I had just cut loose like dead weight. I thought back to all those initial lessons as a mountain guide. If you can't explain where you're going and why as a leader, why would anybody want to follow you? And I had failed. I went back down to base camp, and the team summited, and they came back down to base camp, and they all agreed, and we made each other a promise. If funding came through for Everest the following year, if Eric couldn't make it, none of us were going to go to the summit either. Now keep in mind, this was a lifetime of effort for all of us as guides. We were willing to put all of that on the line and say, if you don't go, we don't go. Now, fortunately for us, funding came through. And it came through in a pretty unique way. And to go to Mount Everest, regardless of what you've read, it's still the biggest mountain in the world. And I'm sure some of you did math problems like this in college. This one kind of went a little something like this. If Luis leaves home with $500,000 and 5 tons of food, fuel, and equipment, flies 6,000 miles, rents 2 Russian helicopters, hires 147 yaks and 36 porters, to walk 48 miles to base camp, how many dollars will Luis have left over? It was this incredible logistical challenge, and to make matters more interesting, they made me expedition treasurer, which, if you've seen my transcripts, math and I do not get along very well. But it's the challenge that you lean into. It's the challenge that you lean into that provides a stretch in a way that you never thought possible. There were mornings that I would wake up and I'd say, you know what, I know my toothbrush is in a yellow duffel bag, and it's on the back of the yak, and I see it about a quarter mile up the trail. I'm not brushing my teeth today. And as we walked into base camp, we started live blogging again and thinking, okay, it's Everest, it's the big game, people are really going to be excited about this. And instead, we kind of got those similar emails, and then the addition to that was people were actually starting to say, wow, now not only are you going back to Everest and going to get the blind guy killed, you conned somebody out of a lot of money to go do this. Who's your stupid sponsor? Now, I show you this picture to give you an idea of what the elevations are like. You can kind of see the differences between the mountains, a couple thousand feet apart, and the summit at over 29,000 feet. And to give you an idea of who those sponsors were that believed what we believe, National Federation of the Blind obviously showed up for Eric. They really understood that to break these barriers, it was going to require funding at that level. And at this point in my career, I had picked up a few sponsors of my own. Allegra, my allergy medicine. So we like to call this expedition the blind leading the sneezy, or the sneezy leading the blind, depending on who you asked. Base camp was a very unique place. You'd open your tent door and you'd see this half cow, half bull yak thing looking at you from outside the tent, but it's a 3-month trip, so you bring everything to be comfortable. We brought stuff for pie, sushi night was a big deal at our base camp, and the occasional yak that misbehaved turned into steak. Now, the interesting thing we did from a PR perspective for our expedition, we knew that people were tenuous about what we were doing, and we strategically brought 20% more food to have what we called potluck dinners at base camp for anybody else that wanted to come and listen to our story of what we were trying to do. So we basically opened our tent doors to people that would just come, sit down, have dinner with us from other teams, and say, why is there a blind person on Everest? How is this going to work? What are you going to do? And I'll never forget, there was this Italian woman that kept waving her face in front of Eric's face, waving her hand in front of Eric's face, saying, he's not blind, I'm going to find him out, I'm going to break the story in Italian media, I'm going to discredit this guy. And Eric could feel the wind from this woman's hand. And he leans over to me and he says, you better tell this woman to stop waving her hand in front of my face, or I'm going to prove to her that I'm blind. Eric has 2 glass eyes, so you kind of have an idea where this is going. So she keeps waving her hand in front of his face, and he finally just pops out an eye and goes booga booga and wiggles it at her, and she screams and goes running out of the tent. The Italian team never came around after that, surprisingly enough. What we did prepare logistically, we were going to be on oxygen for the first time above 24,000 feet, so we tested all of our equipment. Whenever I show people this picture, they're like, wow, Luis, you live really comfortably at base camp. And I say, yeah, but this is base camp, we're just testing oxygen, we're not using it. And they say, yeah, but what's that box of Franzia wine in the background? That's pretty great. It's a 3-month trip, you try to bring everything to be comfortable. Now, the one time you know when it's actually Mount Everest is when it starts to snow. You'll start to hear this low rumble outside the tent, and somebody will stick their head in and say, you've got to come out and see this. And everybody will pile out of the dining tent, and you'll see these massive avalanches ripping off of 4,000-foot alpine walls that would hit the valley floor with such force, if you had a cup of water in front of you, the water in that cup would actually ripple. If any of you followed the incident and the tragedy on Mount Everest last year, this avalanche is in the exact same spot that killed 13 And I loved it. I loved every minute of it. When I think back on that now, all the nights and early mornings sweeping the floor and filling water bottles, it didn't matter because I was connected to the one thing that I was passionate about.